Hey folks, how's it going out there? History 152 land. We are working our way through chapter 24. And we'll conclude it with this lecture. In probably one part. We'll see if we can get this in 20 minutes. If not, it'll be in 2 parts. I'll post a little bit of a video for you as well that I dare not project from YouTube onto YouTube. Some algorithm warns me when I do that, so YouTube doesn't like it. Anyway, we're getting our way through actually Unit 1. So we'll finish Chapter 24 with this lecture, and then that leaves Chapter 25 for next week, both in class on Monday and Wednesday, and then Friday or whenever you want to watch the final video, one piece by video. That should get us into position for our exam on the full unit, unit number 1, chapters 22, 23, 24, and 25. Okay? On that exam, there will be 4 essay questions from the text and lecture, which includes the YouTube lectures. Also, discussion board will be helpful. And 1 question on the 4 current events articles that I've linked. Those are in content. Those are also in an old announcement. But there are links to news articles. I don't mean like today's news. This doesn't count. It's the articles I posted. I posted 1 for each week. I guess at this point, if you want to read all 4 of them, you can. I've not assessed you, I've not tested you on any of that yet. It's just going to comprise one of the 5 essays on the upcoming exam. What else is going on? Well, let's pull up Blackboard and see. There's a quiz due on, let's see when. I want to make sure it didn't expire yet. Okay, there's Chapter 23 quiz is still up and live until September 14th. Okay. I will likely put up Chapter 24 as well, just so we can fit in 11 quizzes before the end of the semester. We grade your best 10, so I need to give you 11 so we can drop 1. Okay? Anything else in contents that we need? Syllabus, that's what I'm following here now. There's the current events articles, okay, in case you're wondering. Now, what are the current events articles? We didn't talk about them in class. No, actually, we've not. This is up to you to read. Certainly ask me questions. It's in a Microsoft Word document. I talk a little bit about current events in every class, but I've not spoken directly on these. Racial reckoning, how do we teach history today? Christopher Columbus statue crumbled and I think beheaded, actually, that one. And then one on, not really current events so much, it's historical myths debunked. Things like Columbus was the only person who knew the earth was round. That's a myth. No, that's ridiculous, right? And then the Ottoman Sultan who changed America. So keep in mind, in the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire, perhaps Ming China, were the most powerful, wealthiest nations on earth, much more so than England. England was nothing, all right? Queen Elizabeth, I'm sorry. Well, I'm not sorry. I don't really like her. But weak and poor, especially in respect to, or in comparison with Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire. And how did that happen? Well, you'll read that. But once the Ottomans take control of the Eastern Mediterranean, it's tough for the Europeans who are rising in wealth to get the stuff over in the East, right? The Ottomans are kind of in the middle, which prompts the Portuguese to start going around Africa, finally make it in 1498, and in the meantime, Columbus went in another direction, and the rest, as they say, is history. So, there we are with the schedule. Again, email me if you have questions on that. Please make sure you're up to speed on the reading. You cannot read 4 chapters during the week of an exam and expect to do well. You can reread the chapters, you can review your notes on the chapters, but to read them all in one sitting and do all the other things you're expected to do for your other courses and work and family and life, it's difficult, right? And if that's the lesson of the first unit, take that with you as we move on. This, by the way, will be one of 4 exams. Okay? It's 20% of your final grade. What's the other 20%? Because 4 exams times 20%, or 80% of your grade comes from the exams. The other 20% will come from the 10 quizzes. Attendance and discussion, participation, yeah, that's all extra credit, okay? That will all help you out. In fact, I'm going to add up to 5 points of extra credit on the first exam for attendance and participation in this unit. And I do that for every exam, there's 20 points. Okay? Up to 20 points extra credit for attendance and participation. Speaking of current events, just in today's news, I'm not sure when you're watching this, but in today's news, much of the Pacific West, not just the coast, Pacific West is fire. California major fires as well, Northern California. Wonder if you kind of think we're in the midst of climate change, like global warming, things are drying out. You can see that, wherever you're watching this from, okay? Sadly, we're in the midst of a pandemic. We're approaching a major national election. Speaking of pandemic, let's see if New York Times lets me get into this without asking me to pay. Oh, they got influence. If you do New York Times too much without paying them, and they do a good service, but I just haven't paid them recently. Oh, they're going to ask me for money. If you read too many articles, they start to ask you for some money. So let's see. Warren County, no, I'm in Chautauqua County. Average cases per day, 7.1. Starting to get better. All right, those your friends in SUNY Fredonia are settling down apparently. But look at the hot spots, and it's just kind of the darker the color. Wow, right? Especially in the south. Opened a bit too early after the initial shutdown. Not a lot out here. Why? Because not a lot of people live out here. Okay, but some hot spots. Moving into the south, or at least have been in Florida's been. Parts of Florida have been a hot spot for a long time. Texas, North Carolina. Okay, so keep that in mind, especially if you're going out of the county. But please follow the protocols and trust the science. Okay, we've all worked really hard since mid-March to try to contain COVID-19 in Chautauqua County. Let's keep up the good work, so we don't have to totally shut down things again. Okay, well, with that said. Speaking of disease and pandemics, we are working our way through a rather difficult chapter. I mean, emotionally it's difficult, right? The Americas and Oceania, we are going to see native peoples in both the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific Island nations, well, not nations at the time, Pacific Islands cultures succumb to disease, right? Pandemic proportions, diseases that are highly virulent, much more so than what we're dealing with. And worst of all, perhaps, no one knew what caused disease, like smallpox. Okay. You know what causes smallpox today? There's not been a case of smallpox on the planet since the 1970s. None of you are vaccinated against it, but we do have a vaccine. And unless you've been in the military, then they vaccinate you. Just in case those riskies let it out of a frozen test tube or something, or somebody, bioterrorism, right? We don't want our frontline military personnel to die. Your history professors? Not so valuable, apparently. Okay, so the new, I hate the title of your chapter, right? New Worlds. Oh, I got it up there anyway. Americas in Oceania. Look, people, I know Bentley, you're like one of the foremost world historians. With all due respect, he's passed away. And it's a really tough field, world history. How the heck do you organize this stuff, right? Chronologically? Well, yeah, but you can't just say everything that happened in the year 1500, then 1501, 1502, it would make no sense. So you need to take a regional approach, and within those realms or regions, chronology. Nonetheless, I guess I would say the Western Hemisphere and Oceania in the 16th through the 18th centuries would kind of be my tweet or title instead of this. So we talked about colliding worlds, Iberian empires in the Western Hemisphere, Iberia meaning Portugal and Spain, across the Atlantic into the Americas, ultimately setting up colonies, but the initial goal was trade. The initial goal was not to try to make money in the Americas. The initial goal was to get to Asia, where there's already stuff to buy and sell. Well, to buy and then to sell your stuff. Okay? The Spanish are going to have to settle for mining, which is they use enslaved Native Americans to do, of silver and some gold. Also hacienda farming with forced labor, encomienda labor of Native Americans. The Portuguese will, I guess you could say, settle for, they make a fortune out of it, growing sugar in Brazil with Native American, but also increasingly over the course of the 16th century and 17th centuries, enslaved labor from Africa. As Native people succumb to disease, or we hope to God they were able to run away and form maroon communities deep in the interior of Brazil, they were, well, their gain is someone else's loss, right? They were replaced by African labor, enslaved African labor. Remember, the Portuguese have outposts on the coast of West Africa. Well, Spain is a powerful country in the 16th century, the 1500s. England, again, as I said in the beginning, is fairly weak. The English have to go further north. There's no gold, there's no spices, there's no can't grow sugar in Virginia, I suppose, with any great success. But they hit upon a Native American crop, tobacco. And if you've ever smoked or chewed or vaped, you get it, right? You hooked on this stuff, and if you're a European, in the mid-1600s, you're going to get hooked on this and want more and more and more. So more and more tobacco is going to be planted in the Chesapeake region, okay? Which is going to lead to more and more English women and men, very poor, as indentured servants, really forced labor to come over from England to try to start new lives, but they end up working for at least 7 years for a man who paid for their passage and might not even live that long. Okay, so these are really wretched lives for the white indentured servants who increasingly are working side by side with African enslaved people, doing the same job, living together, frankly sleeping together, being treated pretty much equally. But in time, as life expectancy increased, as the indentured servants began to live longer, and after their 7 years actually wanted land and maybe political rights, at least for the men, their labor will be replaced with that of enslaved Africans. We have what we call chattel slavery, meaning a human being is purchased, has absolutely zero rights, can be killed by the so-called master. That person's children will be the property of the master or the master's children forever, right? Chattel slavery. So a real denigration. I mean, slavery had been around from really the beginning of civilization, prisoners of war, debtors, people accused of witchcraft, but now it's based upon skin tone. So we will see the construction, right? The building, the mental construction of racism to justify slavery, which was necessary in this early age of capitalism due to a labor shortage, right? Who's going to grow the tobacco? Who's going to grow the rice in the Carolinas? Who's going to grow the sugar in Brazil, or increasingly in the Caribbean? I blame the Portuguese, but the English, the French, the Dutch, they're going to exacerbate slavery, right? They're going to grow sugar in the Caribbean with enslaved labor. Native American, but especially African labor. The French go further north. You're not even going to be able to grow tobacco, but you can do a lot of fishing off the coast of what is now Canada. If you come up, you might think down, looking at the map, but up the St. Lawrence River, into Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, the Great Lakes, the trapping of fur. You're like, for what? What? Fur? Who cares, right? Mink and beef, especially beaver. Well, wealthy people in Europe wanted rare stuff. They wanted sugar on their table with some pepper, with a servant who was not of the same skin tone as they, meaning that person came from far away. They wanted luxury goods from China, silk. Wanted silk for thousands of years. And in a fur hat, or a beaver hat, a fur coat. Okay? The Russians start to do the same thing. The European Russians are doing essentially the same thing, moving into the colds of Siberia to trap fur, or to get someone else to do it for them, to trade them stuff. Like the French will trade the Algonquin people, knives and cooking pots and colorful beads and glass and things that did not exist in Native American society yet. It also, unfortunately, exchanged disease, or pretty much just a one-way transit. Right? Native Americans now in the north will succumb to smallpox and other diseases brought over by the Europeans unwittingly. Right? And the other thing I'll speak in mind, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese were also interested in converting native people to Catholicism. So this relates back to chapter, whatever it was, chapter 20, the Reformation, right? Catholicism loses half of Europe and they can't get it back, so they engage in missionary work to try to convince non-Christians to become Catholic. Obviously, to some extent it worked, even in a shallow sense. Native people, especially in what becomes Spanish and Portuguese, Latin America, will convert at least in name. Do they really absorb all of that? I would say probably not. Do the Algonquins and the Hurons absorb Catholicism from the French Jesuits? Probably not, but it was good for trade. Okay? It's being a bit cynical there. Europeans will also go into the Pacific, Australia and the Pacific Islands, where they will, again, unwittingly spread disease to the peoples, the Aboriginal people of Australia, for example, will succumb to European diseases. That happens later. It's in the 1780s, but the end result is as negative, right? The tremendous loss of life and culture. Okay, so that was my introduction. We talked about all of this in a bit more detail, pulling it really just directly from your book. Cortez and Doña Marina, Malinche, as she was called, is an interloper, right? He's an intermediary between probably the Aztecs here, whose language he spoke, and Spanish. The Spanish, whose language he also spoke, really helping to guide Cortez in the conquest of the Aztec Empire. Pizarro's brothers take Peru. Both empires, Native American empires, had been beset by disease. With regard to the Inca Peru, they'd also experienced civil war just really prior to the Spanish arrival. The Spanish killed Atahualpa, the Inca ruler, who was seen as a god by his people, which is, just adds psychological defeatism. People are dying of disease, and the culture is in shambles, right? This pessimism. I mean, you see a little of that now in the United States, okay? Just imagine what it was like for these people in the 1530s in Peru. So Pizarro, you think you can take Peru and Cortez, Mexico. No, the king has other ideas. Basically, you're fired. Here's some money, get lost, go retire. I'm putting my own people in charge. Right? The Treaty of Tordesillas, just keep in mind the Pope doesn't want somehow Spain and Portugal to fight with one another, draws a line when he thinks is halfway through the Atlantic, and every new territory, yes, new to Europeans, on the right side of that line, the eastern side of that line, goes to Portugal, and everything on the other side, the left or western side, goes to Spain. And look, the tip of Brazil ends up being over the line. And so the Portuguese will take Brazil. They'll exploit the land, labor, as we mentioned at the outset. I mentioned there's no one else here. All right, the French, the English, and the Dutch. We kind of failed to mention the Dutch. Well, they're not around for long in eastern New York, or New Amsterdam, as they called it, up and down the Hudson River. They began to trade guns for fur. So, hey, Mohawks, Haudenosaunee, right? Here's some guns, go trap the beavers, go hunt the beavers, whatever. You really don't want to shoot the beavers, though, right? Because then they have a big hole in your beaver hat, so go trap them. But here's some guns to do so. Well, as beaver populations are depleted in your tribe's hunting, trapping zone, you take the guns and move into someone else's, and that's going to spark beaver wars, right? Tribe versus tribe, native versus native, Algonquin versus Haudenosaunee. French on one side, English, Dutch will go home, they get pushed out. So the English will end up taking over the trade of the Dutch, supporting the Haudenosaunee. Okay, which kind of brings us where we left off. This map reproduced from your book. Just checking my time here. Portuguese, right, in orange. These images, colors trying to blend together for me as well, so I'm sure. The Spanish taking Rio de la Plata, Andes Mountains, New Granada, which was a source of the silver. New Spain, way up into what is now the American Southwest, including Florida. Not really occupied, okay? They had some missions, they were St. Augustine in Florida, but they've really focused their effort really in the heart of the Aztec and Inca empires. Okay? Leaving the north, right, in purple here, to the English. Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement. Almost failed. At one point it was down to like 35 men who were just basically starving through the winter of 1608, 1607 to 1608. Native Americans fed them. Yes, that was a big mistake looking back. Why? Because the Native Americans, the Powhatans in that region, well, these guys are a joke, but we might as well help them because they have those guns, and we can, they may be able to helpful to us against our Native American enemies, Indian enemies. The French claiming much of North America, much of Canada, much of the United States, including like where I'm standing right now, Chautauqua, right? Baron de Celeron came through here in 1749, right? Who knows, maybe a French missionary at some point, right? Moving up the St. Lawrence River, we have Quebec, Montreal, the Great Lakes. You can get from Lake Erie, which is not too far from where I'm standing, to Lake Chautauqua, which is even closer. Just carry a canoe over kind of the Westfield escarpment, and put your canoe in Lake Chautauqua and go down the river system and end up eventually in New Orleans, French colony, right? La Nouvelle Orléans. So Western New York